Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Mountain Pass, Kentucky. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1891, and Mountain Pass was little more than a rough stop along the winding wagon road that connected Pike County's scattered farms to the rail line further north. Travelers passing through the hills often remarked on how the fog seemed to cling to the bends in the road, a curtain that settled heavy in the hollows. It was in this haze that the Blackwood brothers, Elijah and Thomas, operated their modest inn. From a distance it was unremarkable, a two-story frame building with a porch, smokehouse and barn, yet the place had gained a reputation for being dependable shelter when weather turned or the roads washed out. The Blackwood family had arrived in the region a generation earlier, their father a carpenter from Virginia. Elijah, the elder, was known in town as a stern church deacon who rarely smiled but spoke with authority. Thomas, younger by 5 years, apprenticed early as a butcher, his skill in carving meat prized by farmers who brought hogs and cattle for slaughter. Together they presented an image of respectability, one man of the church, the other of honest trade. County records from that period note that the inn took in anywhere from 4 to a dozen guests a week depending on the season. Teamsters hauling timber, miners seeking work, even circuit preachers passed through its doors. The ledgers, later recovered in damaged condition, tell us that Elijah kept meticulous accounts, names, dates, payment received. But here and there a line was crossed out with a peculiar note in his tidy script. Account settled in full. At the time, no one thought much of it. Guests came and went in those hills, and it wasn't unusual for strangers never to be heard from again. The Hatfield-McCoy feud, still remembered in the mountains then, had cast a long shadow across eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, teaching locals that disappearances could be explained away by family grudges, debt, or the hazards of frontier justice. Against this backdrop, the vanishings at Mountain Pass Inn blended into the fog of rumor. Still, whispers began to circulate by the late 1880s. A farmhand named Samuel Darnell told neighbors he had heard digging by lantern light near the Blackwood property while passing on the road after midnight. A woman named Clara Mayfield, who served meals at the inn during harvest months, later testified that she once found the kitchen floor scrubbed but stained, as if something heavy had been dragged across it, and several townsfolk recalled the odd taste of meat smoked in the brothers' shed, gamey, but not like deer, one old miner said decades later. By the autumn of 1891, tension had begun to mount. A young man from neighboring Letcher County, traveling to meet family, failed to arrive. His cousin, uneasy, retraced the path and stopped at the Blackwood Inn. He was turned away brusquely by Elijah, who claimed no knowledge of the missing man. Yet the cousin noted that the cellar doors were locked with new iron bolts, and that Thomas appeared pale and shaken. This was the first time suspicion truly fell on the brothers. Townsfolk began to take stock of how many drifters and travelers had vanished without much inquiry, but as with many such cases in the mountains, concrete action was slow. People were reluctant to accuse churchmen or respected tradesmen. And so the brothers remained, keeping their inn at the bend of the fog-bound road, while unease settled like the mist itself. The land on which the Blackwood Inn stood had a history that predated the brothers' arrival. Courthouse deeds trace ownership back to a family named Hensley, who built the first log structure there in the 1850s. That house burned in uncertain circumstances during the Civil War, when troops occasionally passed through the valley. What rose in its place was the frame boardinghouse the Blackwoods purchased in 1885, its construction financed, according to tax rolls, by a loan co-signed by the local minister, Reverend Josiah Tate. The inn quickly became a landmark on the narrow road. Accounts from travelers in the Pikeville Courier describe it as a stout home where the weary might expect rest and supper. Its porch posts, hand-hewn oak, and the smokehouse in the rear gave the impression of stability. Elijah managed the books, greeting travelers with a cool politeness that many took for simple mountain reserve. Thomas was less visible, often tending the smokehouse or seen hauling sacks toward the cellar at dusk. At church socials and county fairs, Elijah was often at the front of the crowd, his status as deacon giving him influence. He pressed the importance of morality, speaking against liquor and gambling. His sermons, though not long, left an impression of severity. Thomas, by contrast, was described by neighbors as withdrawn, with a nervousness about him. Some remembered him stammering slightly when asked about the business. Others noted that while he handled livestock with precision, he avoided eye contact when dealing with people. The reputation of the inn remained favorable through its early years. It offered hot meals, usually cornbread, beans, and smoked pork, and for a modest fee, a pallet by the fire. But behind its steady facade, cracks began to show. By 1887, a series of disappearances drew whispered attention. A peddler from Ohio, last seen walking toward Mountain Pass with his satchel of goods, failed to reach his intended stop in Pikeville. That winter, 2 German immigrants on their way to work the coal seams vanished after reportedly lodging at the Blackwood Inn. A letter published in the Lexington Herald hinted at a dangerous stretch of road near the inn, but avoided naming it directly. Still, there was no proof. The sheriff's office in Pike County, overburdened with feud violence and moonshiner disputes, had little appetite for investigating drifters. Most locals reasoned that the mountains had claimed them through banditry, accidents, or old family grudges. The memory of the Hatfield-McCoy feud still lingered in the public mind, reinforcing the idea that disappearances were part of mountain life. Yet, some residents were uneasy. A blacksmith named Ephraim Sloan testified years later that he had once brought a wagon load of shoes to the inn and, while waiting for payment, overheard Elijah scolding Thomas, "You've made a mess of it, and the account is not yet clear." Sloan remembered the words distinctly because they struck him as more fitting for a banker than for an innkeeper. Meanwhile, the ledgers, preserved only because they were hidden in the root cellar, show a curious pattern emerging during these years. For every handful of entries marked with routine notes of paid one night, supper included, there appears the unsettling annotation, account settled in full, with the name struck through. No further details, no forwarding addresses, no receipts of travel. By the close of the decade, the Blackwood Inn was both respected and quietly feared. Families still sent young men to stay there when weather forced delay, but many whispered prayers for their safe passage. As dusk settled over Mountain Pass, some locals claimed they could see a lantern swinging behind the inn, moving between the cellar doors and the smokehouse well after midnight. By the spring of 1888, the first murmurs of something amiss began to surface beyond casual gossip. The inn had become a fixed stop for drovers and traveling salesmen, yet a handful of these men failed to arrive at their destinations. Families wrote letters to Pike County asking if anyone had seen their kin. Most were answered with shrugs and the familiar refrain, "The mountains keep their own." Still, a few fragments of testimony slipped into the county records. One such account came from a miner named James Ratliff, who recalled stopping at the Blackwood Inn during a rainstorm. He later told a deputy that he woke in the middle of the night to a dull thudding sound beneath the floorboards, as if someone were driving a stake into wet earth. Ratliff, unnerved, left before breakfast, forfeiting his coin rather than linger. His statement, scrawled in the back pages of the sheriff's docket, was never followed up. Around that same year, several residents noticed an oddity in the inn's smokehouse. A farmer named Henry Blevins remembered trading pork with the Blackwoods, only to find that the cuts of meat returned in exchange seemed unusually lean, oddly textured. He told neighbors the flavor was unlike hog or beef, closer to venison, yet not the same. Such remarks were brushed aside at the time. Mountain fare was diverse, and travelers often brought strange provisions. The brothers themselves presented contrasting faces. Elijah grew sterner, more rigid in his public dealings. Witnesses described him as quick to anger if pressed about missing guests, dismissing questions with a curt, "Not my concern." Thomas, meanwhile, appeared restless. A young girl who worked at the inn for a summer claimed she once saw him crying in the stable, muttering, "I can't keep doing this," though she was too frightened to ask what he meant. Local folklore began to stir. Children dared each other to walk past the inn after dark, whispering that shadows moved behind the shuttered windows. Hunters spoke of hearing shovels clinking in the soil long after midnight. Most tellingly, travelers reported that Elijah often discouraged them from staying more than one night, citing full rooms even when the inn was empty. Despite the whispers, the inn's reputation among church elders and county officials remained untarnished. Elijah's standing as deacon shielded him from serious suspicion, and Thomas's skill as a butcher kept local families reliant on their services. In a region still haunted by feuds and lawlessness, no one wished to challenge men who could bury secrets in fog and soil. Years later, during the highway excavations of the 1960s, the ledgers would confirm what the townsfolk only dared whisper. For every 4 or 5 names carefully entered into the book, one would be crossed through, the words "account settled in full" penned beside it. To modernize, these notations carried a sinister weight, but in the 1880s, they were simply another piece of mountain business, unremarked until too late. The first true alarm was sounded in 1890, when a preacher traveling from Letcher County vanished. He had left letters stating he intended to stay at the inn. When his congregation inquired, Elijah insisted he had never seen the man. The denial rang false to some, but without a body or evidence, the matter was dropped. Still, this disappearance began a slow unraveling, both in the town's perception and within the uneasy partnership of the Blackwood brothers themselves. By the summer of 1890, unease surrounding the Blackwood Inn could no longer be dismissed as idle talk. It began with a man named William Arnott, a traveling tinsmith from Letcher County, who set out on the winding Pike County road with a small cart of wares. He sent a letter ahead to his cousin in Prestonsburg, stating he would stop for the night at the inn near the pass. When he failed to arrive, the cousin retraced the route. He found no sign of William, save for faint wagon tracks leading toward the Blackwood property. The cousin knocked at the inn and was met by Elijah, who stood stiffly at the door. Elijah denied ever seeing William and urged him to move along. The cousin, however, later reported a detail that unsettled him. The cellar doors were secured with heavy new bolts, and the smokehouse chimney gave off an acrid scent, unlike ordinary hickory smoke. In his recollection, Thomas appeared in the doorway briefly, pale and trembling, before Elijah closed the door with a force that suggested the matter was finished. This incident was spoken of quietly in town, but it stirred old suspicions into sharper focus. A storekeeper, Mrs. Hannah Caldwell, remarked that she had noticed Elijah purchasing unusual amounts of salt and lye that spring, far more than needed for pork curing. Another neighbor recalled hearing rhythmic hammering at night, like someone boarding up crates, though no wagons ever left the property at dawn. Within the inn, according to testimony later collected, the brothers' relationship was beginning to fray. A farmhand who occasionally delivered wood to the inn swore he heard raised voices one evening. Thomas was shouting, "It's gone too far, Elijah. We cannot answer for this," to which Elijah replied in a cold, measured tone, "You'll do as you're told, or the account will be settled with you." The farmhand claimed he slipped away quietly too, frightened to report it. These accounts, pieced together decades later, show a growing fracture between the brothers. Elijah seemed increasingly rigid, clinging to his role as community deacon to Project Innocence. Thomas, meanwhile, grew visibly gaunt, his hands unsteady when he handled the butcher's knives. Some recalled him staring into the distance during church services, lips moving silently as if in prayer or confession. By late autumn of 1890, disappearances had become more pointed. A young preacher en route to Hazard never reached his congregation, and the last witness to see him alive placed him near Mountain Pass. A pair of miners were said to have stopped at the inn. Only one was ever seen again, and he left town without explanation. Each case was filed away as misadventure or feud violence, yet the pattern was plain to those who kept count. The tension in Mountain Pass was thick. Even so, no sheriff's inquiry was launched, and no charges were filed. Pike County, after all, was still reeling from feud violence, not unlike the Hatfield-McCoy conflict that had only recently cooled to an uneasy truce. Officials were reluctant to chase rumors when their dockets were already burdened with blood feuds and moonshiner arrests. Still, within the fog that clung to the inn's crooked fence posts, the truth was pressing closer. The missing tinsmith's cousin, unsatisfied by Elijah's brusque denials, began to make inquiries of his own. His persistence would soon expose cracks in the Blackwood brothers' carefully maintained facade and drive their partnership toward a breaking point that the winter of 1891 would seal forever. In the winter of 1891, Mountain Pass lay shrouded in near-constant mist. Heavy snowfalls that year blanketed the ridges, cutting off travel for days at a time. This isolation made the Blackwood Inn both a necessity and a place of mounting dread. With the roads treacherous, travellers had little choice but to seek its shelter, even as whispers of disappearances circled in low voices at the general store. The cousin of the missing tinsmith, a determined man named John Arnett, refused to let the matter rest. He spoke with farmers, drovers, and a circuit preacher, carefully piecing together the last known movements of his relative. More than one traveller admitted privately that they had stayed at the inn and witnessed peculiar things: bolted cellar doors, Thomas carrying sacks toward the barn at odd hours, Elijah forbidding anyone from stepping out back after sundown. One man swore he heard muffled cries through the floorboards, but convinced himself it must have been the wind. In January, John returned to the inn under the pretense of seeking lodging. He later described Elijah's hospitality as measured, like a man acting a part. Supper was served, the usual beans and smoked pork, but John noticed Thomas staring at his plate, barely eating. After retiring, John lay awake, listening. From below came the faint scrape of metal on stone, followed by a sound he compared to cleaving butcher's knives against a block. He slipped out before dawn, feigning early travel, and carried his suspicions back to town. Around this same time, townsfolk began noticing strange signs near the property. Snow along the fence line revealed disturbed earth, patches where digging had occurred despite the frozen ground. Lantern light was seen swinging near the smokehouse at hours past midnight. A young boy claimed he saw Thomas carrying a bundle over his shoulder and stumbling in the snow, muttering prayers through clenched teeth. His account was dismissed at the time as childish fancy, yet the boy insisted until his dying day that what he saw was real. By February, tensions between the brothers had escalated to open conflict. A neighbor reported hearing shouting carried on the cold air. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, desperation, even pleading. Weeks later, Clara Mayfield, who sometimes assisted with meals, recalled that the kitchen floor was scrubbed harshly, raw wood exposed where stains refused to lift. There was a smell, she told interviewers decades later, like iron and smoke together. Then came March, when the first undeniable trace of violence emerged. A teamster passing through stopped at the inn for supper. While waiting for Thomas to fetch bread from the cellar, he noticed a dark smear along the threshold near the kitchen door. He bent down, certain it was blood, though dried and faint. Elijah quickly ushered him to the fire, claiming it was spilled wine. The teamster told no one until years later, ashamed he had ignored his instincts. As winter waned, the Arnett family pressed the sheriff for action. Though the request was half-heartedly noted in the county docket, no formal search was conducted. The sheriff remarked, "No proof, no crime." But John Arnett and a few others in town had already begun to see a pattern too sinister to ignore. The ledgers, though still hidden, were quietly being filled with more names crossed out, accounts settled in full, scrawled in neat handwriting. Something was breaking inside the Blackwood Inn. Elijah grew colder, more commanding, while Thomas seemed to collapse under the weight of guilt. Those who glimpsed him in town spoke of his gaunt face and shaking hands. In the community's silence, the brothers continued their work, but the fractures in their facade had widened, and the horror within their walls would be exposed in ways no one in Pike County could deny. By the early summer of 1891, the inn's reputation had begun to shift in subtle but telling ways. Travelers who once spoke of it as a reliable haven now approached its porch with unease. Farmers delivering produce noted that while Elijah maintained his rigid politeness, Thomas appeared increasingly drawn and vacant, often staring past them as if lost in thought. His once precise hands trembled when weighing cuts of meat, and on more than one occasion, neighbors whispered that he flinched when Elijah's gaze fell upon him. The smokehouse behind the inn became the focus of uneasy speculation. Its chimney seemed never to cool, even on days when no slaughter had been arranged. A miner named Daniel Hobbs, who stayed the night in May, later recalled that the pork served at supper had a queer tang, not hog nor beef, but something in between. Hobbs admitted that he forced himself to eat out of politeness, but afterward the taste lingered so strongly that he avoided meat for weeks. Others described similar experiences, but always in hushed tones, unwilling to accuse the deacon outright. Children in Mountain Pass dared each other to creep toward the property and reported seeing Thomas hauling heavy sacks into the cellar under cover of fog. One boy, who years later swore the memory haunted him, claimed the sacks were damp and left a dark trail in the snowmelt. Their parents scolded them for speaking such tales, but the stories spread nonetheless, becoming a kind of folklore whispered among the young. Inside the inn, tension grew between the brothers. A former hired hand recounted overhearing Thomas late one night, pacing and muttering prayers aloud, pleading with God for forgiveness. "I cannot wash it away," he repeated, again and again, until Elijah's voice cut him off sharply. "Be silent, or I'll see you buried in the same earth." The hand left his position shortly after, citing fear for his life. Meanwhile, Elijah's public image hardened. In church meetings, he became more forceful, chastising the congregation for moral weakness and warning against gossip. Some parishioners found his sermons unsettling, noting that his eyes seemed to search the crowd as if daring anyone to speak out. His authority as a deacon insulated him from suspicion, and his careful record-keeping in county matters gave him the air of legitimacy. Yet beneath this exterior, signs of collapse were evident. Journal fragments discovered decades later hinted that Thomas had begun keeping his own notes, short entries describing sleepless nights, strange dreams, and a dread of the cellar work. While much of these scraps were lost or destroyed, the surviving lines suggest a man tormented by guilt and fear. By midsummer, locals had begun to avoid the inn unless absolutely necessary. Wagoners chose longer routes, and circuit riders prayed for clear weather so they could pass without stopping. The once busy lodging house now saw fewer guests, which only made the disappearances more conspicuous when they occurred. Each new absence weighed heavier, each denial from Elijah colder, and each tremor from Thomas more revealing. The inn still stood tall at the bend in the fog-bound road, its lantern glowing each evening. But those who saw it from a distance spoke of a heaviness in the air, as though the ground itself resisted giving up its secrets. The Blackwood Inn had become less a shelter than a shadow, an ominous presence that travelers passed quickly, whispering prayers until the fog swallowed it from view. By late summer of 1891, the disappearances were no longer isolated whispers, but a mounting tally that townsfolk could no longer ignore. In August, 2 brothers from Pike County were last seen driving a mule cart laden with tools. They were reported to have stopped at the Blackwood Inn, but neither man ever reached their destination in Pikeville. Weeks later, a schoolteacher traveling to visit relatives vanished along the same road. His letters, preserved in county files, placed him squarely in Mountain Pass on the night before he disappeared. John Arnott, still searching for answers about his missing cousin, began pressing harder. He spoke with anyone willing to share suspicions, gathering a rough ledger of vanishings. By his reckoning, at least 7 travelers in as many years had failed to reappear after passing through the bend where the Blackwood Inn stood. John even confronted Elijah directly on the road one Sunday, demanding to know what had become of William. Witnesses later claimed Elijah's face went white before he recovered his composure and replied, "Your accusations are sin itself. Take care where your tongue leads you." Despite Elijah's authority in the church, murmurs spread through the congregation. A handful of parishioners recalled his recent sermons, in which he spoke obsessively of debts being paid and accounts brought into balance. Though delivered in religious language, the phrasing carried unsettling echoes of the ledger entries later discovered in the cellar. Account settled in full. That autumn, several incidents pushed fear into sharper focus. A group of hunters camping nearby reported hearing frantic digging during the night, accompanied by muffled cries quickly cut short. They admitted they drank heavily that evening and were uncertain of what they heard, but their testimony decades later matched similar claims from others in the alley. Another witness, a wagoner named Isaac Morton, said that when he stopped at the inn for supper, he saw Thomas carrying what looked like a severed hog's head into the cellar, only as Morton put it, it was too small, too fine-boned for swine. Thomas, meanwhile, was visibly deteriorating. His gauntness had become alarming, his cheeks hollow, his eyes ringed with sleepless shadows. A store clerk in Pikeville recalled him buying laudanum, muttering that he needed it to quiet the nights. His hands, once steady as a butcher, shook so violently that he nearly dropped a cleaver while working at the smokehouse. Some neighbors interpreted this as weakness. Others saw it as evidence of a conscience tearing itself apart. In contrast, Elijah appeared colder and more commanding. When questioned by townsfolk about the missing travelers, he dismissed their concerns with practiced authority. "The mountains take their due," he declared at one meeting, his tone leaving no room for rebuttal. His composure, however, only deepened suspicions. It was as though he had embraced a role beyond reproach, daring anyone to pierce the facade. By September, even those loyal to Elijah in the church had grown uneasy. Attendance dwindled and some families began sending their sons along different routes to avoid the inn. Yet fear and respect for the deacon's standing prevented anyone from taking real action. The sheriff remained unmoved, citing a lack of evidence, and the town quietly looked the other way. But cracks were showing in the Blackwood Brothers partnership. Witnesses spoke of heated arguments late at night, voices carrying on the fog. Thomas was said to plead for forgiveness, while Elijah's replies grew sharper, darker, invoking debts and reckonings. In these exchanges, preserved only in the memories of neighbors, lay the first signs that the brothers' alliance was unraveling. The disappearances had become too many to ignore, and Mountain Pass was holding its breath. Something inside the inn was reaching a breaking point, and before the year closed, violence would burst. By late October of 1891, the strain inside the Blackwood Inn could no longer be concealed. Neighbors began reporting sounds of shouting carried across the fog, sometimes lasting well into the night. One farm couple, the Maguires, swore they heard Thomas crying out, his voice breaking with desperation, "I won't be part of it no more." The reply, a harsh bellow they attributed to Elijah, cut across the valley. "Then you'll share their rest." The tension became visible to outsiders as well. Travelers who stopped at the inn described a grim atmosphere. Supper was still served with formality, but the dining room felt weighted with silence. Thomas often avoided eye contact, his hands trembling as he set down plates. Elijah, on the other hand, maintained a rigid calm, watching both guests and his brother with the same cold intensity. A merchant named Levi Craddock later recounted that he noticed a dark stain near the kitchen door, something scrubbed but not fully erased. "It was no wine, and no spill I'd ever seen," he testified years later. The cellar doors, bolted and barred, drew constant curiosity. On more than one occasion, locals reported seeing Elijah standing guard near them at dusk, lantern in hand, as though daring anyone to approach. Rumors spread that the brothers kept more than food preserved beneath the inn, that valuables from vanished travelers were being hoarded, or worse, that graves had been dug in the packed earth below. It was during this period that Clara Mayfield, who sometimes helped with cooking, gave her most chilling testimony. Called to assist one evening, she found the kitchen reeking of iron and smoke. On the table lay a cleaver and a basin that appeared hastily washed, faint traces of blood clinging to its rim. When she asked Thomas what had happened, he whispered, "We can't wash it away anymore." Elijah entered then, his face unreadable, and ordered her from the room. Clara never returned to the inn. By November, Thomas's collapse was apparent. He was seen wandering the churchyard at odd hours, muttering prayers. Parishioners described him as hollow-eyed, racked by guilt. Elijah continued to attend services, projecting authority, but his sermons grew more peculiar, filled with references to debts settled and sins purged through sacrifice. Though cloaked in scripture, the phrasing unsettled those who recognized its echo in his ledgers. The first undeniable sign of violence came in December. A passing wagoner stopped for a meal, and while Thomas fetched bread from the cellar, glimpsed something beneath a cloth on the kitchen counter. He swore it was a human hand, pale and limp, before Elijah quickly covered it. The wagoner left without finishing his meal, and spoke of it only decades later, fearful of being disbelieved. Shortly after, Thomas disappeared entirely. Some said he fled into the mountains. Others believed Elijah silenced him to keep the inn's secrets intact. What is certain is that Thomas was never seen again after the second week of December. Elijah continued to operate the inn alone for a short while, but by year's end he abruptly sold the property and vanished, leaving behind unpaid accounts and unanswered questions. The building stood empty for years, its windows shuttered, its smokehouse collapsing into weeds. Then, in 1904, a fire of unknown origin consumed the structure entirely. Some claimed it was lightning, others arson. Whatever the cause, the Blackwood Inn's physical shell was gone, leaving only rumors, suspicions, and a void in the records where truth should have been. In the years that followed Elijah's sudden disappearance, Mountain Pass seemed almost eager to let the memory of the Blackwood Inn fade. The property, though still standing, was avoided by most locals. Travelers no longer stopped there, and families in Pike County began steering their sons and daughters along alternate routes. The abandoned house sat at the bend in the road, its windows shuttered, its porch sagging, like a scar left untended. The county records show little movement on the matter. Deeds indicate that Elijah sold the land in haste to a distant cousin, who never once visited the property. Taxes went unpaid for years, and eventually the county seized the land. Yet, curiously, no official investigation into the disappearances was ever recorded. The sheriff at the time remarked in a rare surviving note, "No evidence remains. Men vanish often in these hills." Rumors, however, never fully died. Neighbors spoke of hearing noises even after the inn was abandoned, muffled thuds from the cellar, lantern light flickering where no one lived. Children dared each other to run up the porch steps and touch the door, swearing the air grew colder the closer they came. The smokehouse, its roof half collapsed, still carried a faint, acrid odor even years later, leading some to whisper that it had seeped into the timbers themselves. In 1904, the fire came. Whether set deliberately or sparked by lightning, the result was the same. The inn was consumed in a single night. Neighbors watched from a distance as flames licked through the upper windows, sparks rising into the fog. No one called for help. No one attempted to douse the blaze. By dawn, the Blackwood Inn was a blackened ruin. Within days, locals picked over the ashes, claiming to find warped metal bolts, charred ledgers, and fragments of glass jars. What truth these artifacts might have held was lost when scavengers carried them away. For the next half-century, the site slipped into silence. Weeds grew over the foundation, and the cellar doors sank into the earth. The road was widened in the 1930s, and traffic flowed past the unmarked ground without pause. Only the oldest residents still told stories of Thomas's trembling hands, Elijah's cold stare, and the travelers who checked in but never returned. Some framed it as cautionary folklore, a reminder not to trust too easily. Others swore it was all true, but warned their children never to repeat it aloud. It was not until 1963 that the ground itself spoke again. Highway workers, widening the road further, uncovered the remains of the old cellar. When they pried it open, they found not an empty chamber, but a cache of horrors that confirmed what generations had whispered in secret: bones sorted into neat piles. At least 7 individuals, their remains butchered with a professional's precision. Rusted cleavers and knives scattered nearby, glass jars filled with small personal effects, buttons, coins, bits of fabric, even a pocket Bible. And there were ledgers, damaged by fire, but still legible in places. The same handwriting as before, Elijah's neat script, crossing through names with the phrase, "Account settled in full." The discovery in 1963 shook Pike County in ways that decades of silence had failed to. Road crews working on the highway cut directly into the foundation where the Blackwood Inn once stood. Expecting little more than old stonework, they instead found the remnants of a root cellar sealed beneath layers of collapsed timber and charred earth. When the first boards were pried loose, the stench of decay, long muted but never gone, rose into the summer air. Inside, investigators catalogued what would later be described as one of the most disturbing finds in the county's history. Human remains lay in careful, almost deliberate arrangement. At least 7 individuals were represented, though the exact number was difficult to confirm due to the commingling of bones. Each set bore signs of precise butchery, marks on joints and long bones consistent with the practiced hand of someone skilled in slaughter. Forensic notes from the period describe disarticulation consistent with professional technique. The implication was clear. Thomas's trade as a butcher had not been confined to livestock. Scattered among the remains were dozens of glass jars, their lids sealed with wax. Inside were personal items, pocket watches, coins, scraps of clothing, and in one jar, a small Bible with pages stiffened by time and damp. These jars gave investigators their most direct link to the missing. Names could not always be matched, but the objects bore silent testimony to travelers who had entered the inn and never left. Most chilling of all were the ledgers. Though singed by the 1904 fire, several volumes survived intact enough to read. Elijah's handwriting filled their pages, names of guests, dates of stay, payments made, and, as before, the recurring phrase, "account settled in full," written beside entries where no departure was recorded. Roughly 1 in 4 names carried the mark, mirroring the WW. Hispered ratio townsfolk had once suspected. In the margins of one ledger, a note in darker ink read simply, 7 debts paid. Whether this referred to the remains found or more victims lost to time was never determined. The discovery drew in law enforcement from across the state. Though little could be done by then, Elijah had vanished more than 70 years earlier, and Thomas was long presumed dead. Interviews with surviving residents added color, but no resolution. Some recalled the odd flavor of the inn's smoked meats. Others admitted they had suspected foul play, but feared confronting a church deacon. One elderly woman confessed she had once seen Thomas digging near the smokehouse by lantern light, but her husband silenced her, warning, "We need no feud with the Blackwoods." The story reached newspapers as far as Lexington and Cincinnati, though coverage remained cautious. The Appalachian region, already associated with feud violence and hardship, was reluctant to have its darker histories paraded before outsiders. Officials quickly sealed the cellar, collected the remains, and placed them in county storage. Yet in the years that followed, key evidence vanished, ledgers misplaced, jars unaccounted for, and bones reburied in unmarked graves without ceremony. Whether this was bureaucratic negligence or a deliberate act to bury the past, no one could say. Still, the discovery could not erase the whispers that had persisted for generations. If anything, it confirmed them. The Blackwood Inn had not simply been a place of shelter on the fog-bound road. It had been a trap, a ledger-driven enterprise of death, where debts were tallied in flesh and blood. The reaction in 1963 was complicated, almost muted, as though Pike County had been caught between vindication and shame. On one hand, the discovery confirmed what elders had whispered for decades, that the Blackwood Inn had harbored a terrible secret. On the other, it forced the community to reckon with their long silence, their unwillingness to confront the suspicions that had lingered since 1891. Newspapers published cautious headlines. The Lexington Herald leader referred to the find as "grisly discovery at Old Pike County Road." Local reporters framed it as a curiosity rather than a scandal, carefully avoiding words like murder or cannibalism. Officials gave few statements, noting only that the remains appeared very old and that no living suspects remained to answer for them. For many locals, this half-hearted handling was a relief. Families who had grown up under the shadow of the inn had little desire to revisit its horrors. Those who had known Elijah or Thomas in life were mostly gone by the 1960s, and their descendants preferred not to dwell on what their elders might have known. As one resident told a journalist at the time, "Best leave the dead where they lie. We gain nothing dragging up the old soil." Yet the details that did slip into print could not be ignored. The precision of the cuts on the bones, the jars of belongings, the ledgers with their repeated phrase, "account settled in full." These facts trickled out slowly, often pieced together by rumor rather than official statement. Each time the story grew darker in the telling. Folklore rushed to fill the gaps. Some claimed the brothers had served the flesh of their victims to unsuspecting travelers, pointing to the long-standing rumors of strange meat in the smokehouse. Others insisted that Thomas had tried to stop Elijah and that his disappearance in December of 1891 was evidence of his own murder. A few whispered that Elijah had fled west under a false name, blending into another town as a respectable churchman until his death. None of these claims were ever proven. The official response was silence. The remains, after brief study, were stored in county custody and later reburied without markers. The ledgers, initially preserved in evidence, vanished within a decade, their whereabouts unknown. Some suggested they were misplaced in a courthouse fire. Others believed they were deliberately hidden to prevent sensationalism. Whatever the truth, by the 1970s the evidence had all but disappeared. Yet the land itself kept its weight. Locals avoided the site even after the highway cut directly through it. Travelers reported uneasy feelings when driving past the curve where the inn once stood. Truckers claimed their radios sometimes went to static there, or that headlights dimmed in the fog. Children dared each other to walk to the spot at night, and though most fled in fear before reaching it, those who did swore the air grew heavy and still. The Blackwood Inn had burned, its records had vanished, and the county had gone quiet. But the story had not died. Instead, it slipped back into folklore, carried in low voices at porch gatherings and in warnings passed from elders to children. Beware the bend at Mountain Pass, not all debts rest easy in the ground. In the years after the 1963 discovery, the ruins of the Blackwood Inn entered a new stage of life, not as a physical structure, but as a story etched into the collective memory of eastern Kentucky. With the cellar sealed and the evidence dispersed, the site itself became a blank canvas upon which rumor, fear, and folklore painted their enduring shapes. Children growing up in Pike County during the late 1960s and 1970s told stories at campfires about ghostly figures wandering the highway bend. Some swore that if you drove too slowly past the spot at night, you could glimpse a lantern swinging in the fog, just as locals once reported seeing in the Blackwoods' time. Others whispered that the sound of digging could be heard beneath the soil, faint but steady, like shovels striking packed earth. Folklore mixed with fragments of fact. The jars of belongings discovered in the cellar became part of the narrative, exaggerated with each telling. Some claimed entire shelves of jars had been uncovered, each containing a relic of the dead. Rings, teeth, even scraps of hair. Others insisted the jars had been cursed, which explained why they later vanished from the county's records. Whether true or not, the story served to reinforce the sense that officials had deliberately buried the truth. Historians began to take notice. In the 1970s, a professor from the University of Kentucky wrote a brief paper on the case, using it as an example of mountain silence, the tendency of Appalachian communities to close ranks and keep their darker histories unspoken. He noted the striking parallels between the Blackwood Inn and other rural disappearances of the late 19th century. The paper drew on oral histories, one of which recalled the Hatfield-McCoy feud as the cultural backdrop, a time when violence, retribution, and secrecy were woven into daily life, making it all too easy for cases like the Blackwoods to vanish into fog and rumor. By the 1980s, amateur researchers began to retrace the story. Genealogists hunted for traces of Elijah and Thomas Blackwood in census records. A few claimed to find a man of similar age and name living under an alias in Missouri in the early 1900s, but no definitive proof emerged. Others focused on the ledgers, hoping that fragments might still exist in courthouse archives, but searches came up empty. The case remained stubbornly elusive, resisting all attempts to bring closure. Meanwhile, the folklore grew richer. Truckers hauling coal along the highway reported radios cutting out at the bend, headlights flickering, or a sense of heaviness in their chests as they passed. One man claimed he saw a figure step into the road carrying a cleaver, only for it to vanish when his lights reached it. Another swore he smelled smoke and blood together on a foggy night, though no fire burned. To outsiders, these stories were the stuff of legend, but to locals, they carried the weight of generational memory. The Blackwood Inn was no longer just a tale of two brothers. It had become a cautionary reminder that in the Appalachian Hills, not all debts are recorded in books, and not all graves are marked with stones. In the decades that followed, the site of the Blackwood Inn became something of a quiet landmark, though you would not find it on any map or roadside sign. Those who lived nearby referred to it only as the Bend or the Pass, rarely by name, as though speaking of it directly might stir what lay beneath. The ruins themselves had long been erased by roadwork, yet the weight of memory clung to the ground. By the 1990s, a handful of amateur historians and curious travelers began visiting the area, drawn by fragments of the story preserved in old newspapers and local lore. Some hikers reported feeling a sudden stillness when crossing the ground, as though the forest around them held its breath. Others claim to find small items buried shallow in the soil, buttons, rusted nails, fragments of glass, that seem to echo the accounts of the jars uncovered in 1963. None could be directly tied to the Blackwoods, yet each discovery deepened the unease. Local residents often treated these researchers with polite dismissal. "There's nothing to see," they would insist, steering strangers back toward Pikeville. But behind closed doors, some admitted that they themselves avoided the road at night, preferring to take longer routes rather than risk the unsettling silence of the pass. To them, it was not a place of curiosity, but of caution, a ground where too many accounts had been settled in full. Cultural silence remained the most striking legacy. Scholars studying Appalachian communities noted how the Blackwood story paralleled others across the region, tragedies or crimes that were widely suspected but rarely confronted, often left to dissolve into folklore rather than formal record. In this sense, the Blackwood Inn stood as a haunting symbol of communal denial, where respect for status, fear of reprisal, and the hardship of daily survival all conspired to keep the truth buried. Still, whispers persisted. A retired highway worker told his grandson that he had seen more bones in 1963 than were ever officially reported. A church elder admitted that his father had warned him never to question Elijah Blackwood, even after Elijah vanished, and a Pikeville shopkeeper swore that in the early 2000s, 2 out-of-state genealogists came through town asking about the inn, only to leave abruptly after an unsettling visit to the site. "They looked pale as death when they came back," she recalled, said they heard voices in the fog. The folklore around the Blackwood Inn had by then taken on a life of its own. Some called it a ghost story, others treated it as a historical cautionary tale, but among those who lived nearest to Mountain Pass it remained something else entirely, not a tale to entertain, but a reminder that silence, when chosen too many times, becomes its own kind of accomplice. By the early 2000s, the Blackwood Inn had become a recurring subject in niche circles of Appalachian studies, folklore collections, and true crime discussions. While mainstream historians rarely devoted more than a footnote to the case, smaller academic journals occasionally explored it as an example of how communities negotiate silence in the face of atrocity. Professors compared the Blackwood story to other Appalachian disappearances of the late 19th century, isolated inns, feuding families, and the disappearance of transient laborers whose absence left little trace beyond rumor. One historian from Eastern Kentucky University noted that the Blackwood account paralleled folk stories of murder inns that appeared in both American and European tradition. What set the Blackwood case apart, he argued, was the 1963 discovery of physical evidence: bones, ledgers, jars of belongings. Unlike pure folklore, there was tangible proof that something had indeed transpired beneath that inn. Yet the loss of records afterward only deepened the mystery, ensuring it would remain unsolved. Academic interest often circled back to the larger cultural backdrop. The Hatfield-McCoy feud, still fresh in memory during the Blackwoods' time, had created a climate where violence and disappearances could be explained away as part of frontier justice. In that atmosphere, accusations against a respected church deacon and his brother were easily deflected. By the time modern criminology might have intervened, the evidence had burned, scattered, or been quietly buried. The story also fascinated folklorists for its narrative arc. They observed how it contained all the elements of a regional cautionary tale: an isolated setting, a respected figure hiding darkness, whispered disappearances, a final discovery that confirmed the worst fears, and then a return to silence. Some even suggested the Black Woe. Odd legend persisted precisely because it had never been formally resolved. Without a trial, a confession, or an identified grave for Elijah, the story remained unfinished, and unfinished stories endure longest. Meanwhile, cultural echoes continued. Paranormal investigators occasionally visited the site, reporting temperature drops, equipment malfunctions, and the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. Local residents tended to roll their eyes at such claims, yet many admitted privately that they too avoided the spot after dark. Truckers on late-night runs through Mountain Pass still spoke of their radios crackling with static, or the sense of unseen eyes watching from the fog. What emerged over time was a layered legacy, part history, part folklore, part communal guilt. The inn itself had long since been erased, but its story refused to die. It was recounted in college lectures, whispered at family gatherings, and revived each time a new generation of researchers stumbled upon the fragile traces left in old county records. The Blackwood Inn was no longer just an abandoned structure consumed by fire. It had become a symbol of how darkness can be both hidden and preserved, woven into the cultural fabric of a place until it cannot be unstitched. In Mountain Pass, the road may have been widened, the cellar filled and the land smoothed over, but the story still pressed upward, like weeds breaking through asphalt, demanding to be remembered. By the late 20th and early 21st century, renewed attempts to untangle the Blackwood mystery emerged, though none brought closure. Genealogists in particular became fascinated with the possibility that Elijah had not perished in the mountains, but fled under a new identity. Census records from Missouri, Arkansas, and even Illinois revealed men of similar age and background living under names like Elias Wood or E. Black. None could be definitively tied to the deacon of Mountain Pass, but the similarities, occupation in churches, sudden relocations, vague origins, were enough to keep speculation alive. Family researchers scoured Pike County deeds and wills, looking for any trace of inheritance tied to the Blackwood name. They found gaps, property changing hands with no clear heirs, signatures inconsistent with known handwriting. These anomalies only deepened the sense that the brothers had erased themselves from the official record, whether by death or deliberate concealment. Meanwhile, amateur investigators combed through what little remained of the 1963 evidence. County archives yielded only fragments, 2 rusted iron bolts tagged as Blackwood property, a ledger page so badly singed that only a handful of words were legible. The jars of belongings, once whispered about in newspapers, had vanished entirely. Some claimed they were stolen. Others suggested they were quietly locked away in private collections. Without them, many connections to the missing were lost forever. Unresolved sightings added a further layer of mystery. In the 1920s, long before the 1963 discovery, a farmer in Missouri swore he met a man who called himself Eli Woods, a stern churchman with a Kentucky accent. The farmer later said he recognized him years afterward when a newspaper printed an old photograph of Elijah Blackwood. Other rumors placed Elijah as far south as Alabama, living quiet, as a tradesman until his death. No grave was ever identified, and no church record confirmed his passing. As for Thomas, folklore diverged. Some believed he fled into the hills and perished in the cold of winter 1891. Others insisted his body was among those buried beneath the inn, perhaps slain by his brother to preserve the secret. A few even told stories that Thomas had wandered as a madman, confessing to strangers before vanishing into obscurity. Yet none of these accounts were supported by evidence. The absence of finality ensured the Blackwood case remained open in the cultural imagination. Each failed lead, each missing artifact, each unconfirmed sighting left the story dangling, unresolved. This uncertainty, scholars argued, was why the tale endured, because the ledger was never closed, the account never truly settled. By the 2000s, the Blackwood Inn had become a touchstone for local identity. It was invoked in ghost tours, mentioned in college lectures on Appalachian history, and debated in online forums where true crime enthusiasts tried to piece together a case with half its records missing. For Pike County residents, however, it was less entertainment and more inheritance, a shadow passed down through generations, a reminder that some debts of the past remain unsettled, no matter how much time has passed. By the 2010s, the story of the Blackwood Inn had escaped the confines of Pike County and begun circulating in wider circles of pop culture. True crime podcasts, always hungry for obscure and unsolved tales, seized on the narrative. Several episodes featured the brothers, mixing fact with folklore, the missing tinsmith, the jars of belongings, the ledgers marked "account settled in full." Though often dramatized, these retellings spread the case far beyond eastern Kentucky, drawing in listeners from around the world. Television shows devoted to paranormal investigation made the site a point of interest, despite the fact that no physical building remained. Crews set up cameras along the highway bend where the inn once stood, recording fog, static, and unexplained noises in the woods. While skeptics dismissed the footage as tricks of weather and imagination, the episodes gave new life to the legend. They also drew frustrated reactions from locals who resented outsiders treating their quiet past as a stage set for spectacle. YouTube channels followed suit. Amateur historians and dark history storytellers began reconstructing the Blackwood account using county records, newspaper clippings, and oral testimony. Some crafted elaborate theories about Elijah's flight, while others leaned into the cannibalism rumor, suggesting the strange taste of the inn's smoked meat was the central truth of the story. The comment sections filled with debates, some insisting the evidence proved murder, others arguing it was folklore exaggerated by time. For residents of Pike County, the sudden wave of attention was both irritating and inevitable. Older generations, especially those whose families had lived through the rumors, viewed the coverage as exploitation. A retired farmer told one reporter, "They make a ghost story out of what was our shame. They don't know what it felt like, knowing." G-folks vanished, and no one dared speak. Younger locals were more ambivalent, some dismissing the story as superstition, others quietly admitting they still avoided the bend at night. What remained consistent was the silence surrounding the few surviving artifacts. Requests to view the remaining evidence from 1963 were met with vague answers. Archivists claimed the ledgers were lost, officials deflected questions, and the county courthouse kept no accessible record of the jars. This absence only fueled speculation online, with some suggesting an intentional cover-up. Whether through incompetence or design, the disappearance of the physical proof ensured the mystery remained unsolvable. Ironically, this very lack of resolution made the story perfect for modern media. Podcasts and YouTube videos thrived on the open-ended nature of the Blackwood case, offering theories without ever reaching closure. Each retelling pulled new audiences into the fog of Mountain Pass, where history, rumor, and silence entwined so tightly that they could never be separated. And so, more than a century after Elijah sold the inn and vanished, the story found itself not forgotten, but reborn in the digital age, its details dissected by voices far removed from the mountains, while those who lived nearest still walked past the bend with lowered eyes. More than 130 years after the last guests crossed the Blackwood Inn's threshold, the legacy of the case rests not in official archives, but in the uneasy silence that has persisted around Mountain Pass. To this day, locals describe the story as something better left alone, a phrase repeated so often it has become a kind of shield against inquiry. Families whose ancestors lived nearby still trade glances when the subject is raised, as though acknowledging a wound without reopening it. Historians, when they reflect on the case, often frame it less as a tale of murder than as a study of silence. They note how Elijah's position as a church deacon insulated him, how the sheriff's docket treated missing men as routine, and how the community's reluctance to confront him allowed the disappearances to continue unchecked. It is a pattern familiar in Appalachian history, where hardship, loyalty, and fear often outweighed the pursuit of justice. The Hatfield-McCoy feud is often invoked as context, showing how violence and grudges were absorbed into everyday life without resolution from law or authority. The ledger remains the most haunting artifact. Though now missing, copies of excerpts survive in the memories of those who saw them in 1963. The recurring phrase, "account settled in full," has taken on symbolic weight. Some interpret it as Elijah's private justification, reducing human lives to debts closed and tallied. Others see it as a chilling mockery of the bookkeeping respectability he used to shield himself. Whatever the meaning, the phrase has become inseparable from the story itself, echoing across generations as a reminder of lives erased. Modern Pike County has little interest in memorializing the site. There is no marker, no plaque, no mention in tourist guides. The highway bends smoothly past the ground where bones were unearthed, and most drivers never know the history beneath their tires. But for those who do know, the silence feels deliberate. It is not forgetfulness. It is refusal, a communal decision to keep the account closed, even if the ledger itself is gone. Still, the story endures. Each time a researcher asks about it, or a podcast episode revives it, the old questions resurface. How many guests truly vanished? What became of Thomas? Did guilt drive him to flight? Or did Elijah silence him? Did Elijah live out his days under another name, his past hidden behind a pulpit in some distant town? None of these questions have answers, and perhaps they never will. Yet the ground remembers. Those who walk the site at dusk still speak of a heavy stillness, as if the air itself carries the weight of unsettled debts. Folklore says that on nights when the fog is thickest, a lantern swings where no hand carries it, and faint digging sounds rise from beneath the soil. Whether imagination or echo, these tales ensure the Blackwood Inn story remains alive, unfinished, waiting. Even now, the story of the Blackwood Inn refuses to rest. The building is gone, the cellar filled, the ledgers vanished into courthouses and private hands, yet the weight of what happened lingers over Mountain Pass. Locals will not speak of it easily, but when pressed, their voices soften and their eyes drift toward the bend in the road, where fog gathers low and heavy. The unresolved nature of the case is what keeps it alive. No trial was ever held, no confession given, no grave marked with certainty. Elijah Blackwood's fate remains a blank space in the records, while Thomas's disappearance is written off as either guilt-driven escape or fratricide. The missing travelers, peddlers, miners, preachers, and strangers whose families never saw them again are remembered only in fragments, their belongings once catalogued in jars, now lost. The truth, scattered across rumor, silence, and missing evidence, can never be fully retrieved. Historians and folklorists call it a story of erasure of bodies, of records, of accountability. Yet erasure is never complete. The accounts told by witnesses, the traces unearthed in 1963, and the whispered warnings that have carried through generations all insist that something dreadful occurred at that inn, something systematic, something the community chose not to name until the ground itself gave up the evidence. And so the Blackwood Inn endures as both history and cautionary tale. It reminds us of the cost of silence, the danger of respectability wielded as a shield, and the ways in which whole communities can conspire to look away. At the same time, it leaves us with an unsettling reminder: not all debts are recorded in stone, not all graves are marked, and not all accounts are closed. Today, travelers still pass through Mountain Pass, headlights cutting through the fog, unaware of what once stood there. But those who know speak quietly of the unease that clings to the place. They say the bend in the road feels colder, that sometimes the fog hangs thicker, and that if you listen closely on certain nights, you can almost hear the scrape of a shovel beneath the soil and the faint swing of a lantern in the dark. The ledger may be gone, but the story remains unsettled. In Mountain Pass, Kentucky, the account is never fully closed.